All right, good evening. And welcome and thank you very much to the SES and for the introduction. Everybody hear me okay at the back? Is this volume okay? All right. Did anyone walk here tonight?
Bit of it. Oh, sorry, a bit of this.
You walked a bit of that and you walked here tonight. All right. Anyone go walking regularly? How about long distance walking? Any long distance walkers in the crowd? I mean, it's the SES. Someone here has walked across a continent, haven't they? Surely. Anyway, well, what I love about walking, and I'm sure a lot of you will agree, is how it connects you to so many in so many ways, and especially long distance walking. That's literally to the ground beneath your feet. It's to your body and what it's capable of. It's to your thoughts and how they kind of flow at that slow pace of travel. And obviously to the places that you travel through and the people that you meet while you're doing so. And the story of the TCT is less to do with endurance and achievements and more to do with the connections made by putting one foot in front of the other. I'm actually, come on in, grab a seat any way you can. I'm actually a cyclist first and a walker second. I used to do talks like this one about my cycling adventures. I even wrote a couple of books and made some moderately successful documentaries about it. This was me on my first relatively long bike ride, age 24. I was about a year out of university with a degree in computer science, and faced with spending the rest of my life staring at a screen, I had done what felt like the obvious thing and decided to cycle around the world instead, with retrospectively way too much luggage. By the time this photo was taken in winter of 2007, I'd spent about half a year pedaling about 5,000 miles across Europe. I had a very nice month off in Istanbul and had been pedaling along the Black Sea coast of Turkey through freezing rain and slush for what seemed like weeks, and I was absolutely desperate to find somewhere warm and dry to celebrate Christmas. And I'd heard Georgia was a Christian nation, so I'd been pedaling long into the night, sleeping in highway underpasses, all that kind of thing, to try and cross the border before the 25th of December. So imagine my absolute horror when I triumphantly crossed the border into Georgia on Christmas Eve, only to be told that the Georgians followed the Orthodox calendar and they weren't going to be celebrating for another 2 weeks. This guy thought it was hilarious. I continued south into Armenia. This was the coldest winter in living memory. Temperatures down to about -25. But thankfully, rather than camping, I spent most of my nights in the homes of local people who were by far the most hospitable I'd ever met at that point. And through spending time with them, I started to feel a strange sense of affinity with this place. That affinity became a lot more tangible when on my way through Yerevan, I met a beautiful Armenian girl. All of a sudden, my round-the-world bike ride had been put on hold. Armenia was my new home. And 2 years later, we got married. Still are. This was my introduction to the little-known corner of Eurasia known as the Caucasus, or the South Caucasus, or Transcaucasia, which consists of the republics of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And putting my love life aside for a moment, there was something about these people huddled away in these mountains, overlooked by the world, having endured some truly desperate times since the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, but still preserving their identity and their traditions, and all amongst some of the most spectacular and impenetrable looking mountains I'd ever seen. The Caucasus Mountains cover an area bigger and taller than the Alps, including Europe's highest mountain, Mount Elbrus, at 5,642 metres. It's a global biodiversity hotspot with ecosystems from temperate rainforest to high altitude steppe to alpine peaks and glaciers. And of course, we're aware of the role that biodiversity hotspots play in the global environmental crises of today. And it's a cradle of civilization. They found 1.8 million year old hominid skulls in Georgia a few years back. Armenia, or an ancient Armenian kingdom at least, became the first official Christian nation in 301 AD. And the region even claims to be the birthplace not just of wine, but of industrial scale winemaking. So cheers. And it's so ethnically and linguistically diverse a region that the only places more so are the Amazon basin and Papua New Guinea. And this is all in a region roughly twice the size of the UK. One thing that had really struck me when I first passed through on a bicycle was just how little information there was for travellers, especially if, like me, you didn't speak Russian or any of the local languages. The region just didn't really seem to be on the map at all. And I do mean literally, this was Google Maps in 2008. Lonely Planet decided that all three countries could be rolled into one in an incredibly small volume. The Brad Travel guys decided Armenia was actually an appendix of Georgia. And obviously there was nothing to do but visit monasteries. You could just about find a road atlas to drive or cycle through the region, but the best topographic maps of the mountains had been made by the Soviet military and were still classified. And the next best were from the Russian imperial times, which I did find a few of up the road at the RGS, but they're a little bit out of date, having been made in the 1870s. And I could carry on. I once asked the British ambassador in Yerevan how many expats they had on their register. About 72, they said. I mention all of this just to demonstrate what kind of a black hole I'd found myself in as an adventurous traveller looking for information. If I wanted to explore the Caucasus myself, I would basically have to just walk out the door and see what I found. So in 2015, that's exactly what I tried to do. My plan was to slow down even more and not cycle but walk the length of Armenia. I figured that by doing so, I'd get to know this country that had become my second home a little bit better, and ideally come back with a story that would one day make for a 45-minute talk in a pub. That so little seemed known about or documented about these mountains made them all the more enticing, and I'm sure many of you here will understand that feeling. And yes, there were blisters, and yes, there was bushwhacking, and there were beautiful views, and there was wonderful hospitality, but there was also something about it that just felt a little bit futile. I knew that I could do it because I'd spent years on much more challenging expeditions elsewhere in the world. And although I might be able to turn it into a talk or a few articles, maybe a book or a moderately successful documentary, I would basically be repeating the same old formula to perpetuate a lifestyle of travel and adventure. And I needed something, I realised, with a little bit more purpose. Then one day, I met an elderly Frenchman called Terry. He'd spent 2.5 years walking from France to Armenia and was on his way to Iran. He carried that much luggage. His toes were poking out of his trainers. He chain smoked constantly. Well, he was French. And yeah, I was, he said I could use this. I was talking to him about all this and about feeling disillusioned and needing something a bit more meaningful to get my teeth into, and also whinging about how little information there was and the lack of maps and all the rest of it. And he simply said to me, well, Why don't you publish your route so that other people can follow it? And I suddenly understood the meaning of the phrase light bulb moment. Yes, I would build a trans-Armenian, no, scrap that. I would build a Transcaucasian Trail. I had sudden visions of this slow but epic journey that would follow the greater and lesser Caucasus Mountains from the Russian border through Georgia and Armenia and even into Iran, why the hell not, connecting the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea and creating an incredible opportunity for others to discover this wonderful part of the world for themselves. It was really a strange moment, as if the idea had been floating around and just suddenly dropped into my head. Didn't actually have the foggiest idea how I would do it, but it didn't seem to matter because I'd finally found a purpose and I didn't really have anything else to do. So I think it's worth saying that creating a long-distance walking trail is not a new idea. These things serve a powerful need that we have to just know what's on the other side of the horizon. And of course, our ancestors colonized every corner of the globe by following each other's trails on foot. Empires were built at somewhere between 3 and 4 miles an hour. Christianity took long-distance walking and rebranded it as the pilgrimage. The Western world's oldest long-distance trail is the Camino de Santiago, whose golden age was about 1,000 years ago, and which my wife and I had actually walked earlier that year. Industrialization changed things a little bit. Trains and cars meant that we began to walk for recreation instead of transport. This is the 1932 Kinder mass trespass, in which factory workers from the industrial Midlands took to the Peak District to protest for the right to roam. And that has since been called the most successful direct action in British history. And it paved the way for, amongst other things, the UK's first national trail, the Pennine Way. And at around the same time as this, American volunteers were building the Appalachian Trail, which is now the longest walking-only trail in the world. It stretches 2,200 miles through 14 US states. More than 2 million people a year do at least one day of hiking on the Appalachian Trail today. Per year, yeah. And since the pandemic, long-distance walking appears to be having even more of a renaissance. In 1986, 1,801 pilgrims registered at the Shrine of St. James at the end of the Camino. 2024, anybody want to guess? 499,239 people did the same thing, which is a 28,000% increase in one generation. And more than half of them are doing it for non-religious reasons. Even the Transcaucasian Trail wasn't actually a new idea. I had read a book called Bread and Ashes by the English travel writer Tony Anderson, who had traversed the Greater Caucasus on foot in the 1990s, and had, by doing so, had kind of achieved legendary status amongst the expats of the Caucasus. Several regions of northern Georgia were beginning to see the beginnings of modern mountain tourism. So formalizing a long-distance trail almost seemed inevitable. So when, a bit early on that one. So when I tried to register transcaucasiantrail.com, I shouldn't have been totally surprised to find that a few weeks earlier, somebody had already done so. And it took me about 5 minutes to do what the KGB would have had to launch a major international spying operation to do. I looked up the domain registration records, plugged the name into the Facebook search box, and found a guy called Paul Stevens. That was on his Facebook profile. Anyway, Paul had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Georgia, and it turned out he'd been thinking about pretty much the same idea himself, and had even started mapping out some routes. So I called him up for a chat, And the TCT began to take shape more as a network of interconnected trails. So while Paul wanted to concentrate on the Greater Caucasus of northern Georgia, I would continue what I'd already started in southern Georgia and Armenia. So where do you even start with something like this? You can't just Google how to build an international long-distance hiking trail. Well, you probably can AI it now, but yeah. So someone else might have started by hiring a consultant or embarking on a stakeholder engagement exercise, or maybe writing a really long and detailed proposal. The only thing I knew how to do was go exploring and keep going until I found something like what I thought was a good enough route. It would be useful to have some help with that, I thought, maybe an off-road vehicle and a driver, somebody with good GIS skills. I thought perhaps a photographer, a videographer, and then obviously the resources to spend weeks or months in the field. In fact, what I quickly realized I needed was an expedition. Why don't you apply for the Land Rover bursary? Somebody said. They'll give you a 4x4 and some cash. And the Land Rover bursary was at this point the RGS's most prestigious annual grant. So I threw together a proposal to meet the deadline 2 weeks later, gave the most nerve-wracking interview of my life, and a couple of months later received a call from the RGS to tell me that I'd actually got it. So I called up Alessandro, a mapping expert I'd met in Yerevan, and in April 2016, we drove this brand new, specially modified Defender, one of the last off the production line, away from the gates of the RGS, thinking, shit, now I'm actually going to have to do it. Nine days later, we crossed the border into Georgia, which was a really good reminder both that the Caucasus isn't actually that far away, and also that a Defender is not actually the most comfortable vehicle for 3,500 miles of European highways. It is, however, just about the best vehicle imaginable for a 6-month survey of the Caucasus Mountains and its trails. And what followed was about the most intense and fascinating year of my life so far. It was true exploration, it was adventure, it was everything I loved and had become relatively good at. And there was an actual point to it all, and this might sound a bit silly, but this was quite a novelty for me. I no longer needed to create elaborate justifications for roaming the wilderness with a machete and a GPS unit. Everyone I spoke to kind of just got it, and usually had their own take on it as well. The trail would be good for tourism, people said, of the kind that would spread the benefits generously and leave little or no trace. It would be good for conservation, other people said, bringing resources to protected areas who are struggling to control illegal logging and hunting. It would be good for people, a steady stream of new opportunities to otherwise deprived places. It could even be good for peace building, giving otherwise hostile neighbours a rare flag of optimism around which to rally. The Transcaucasian expedition, as we called it, identified about 2/3 of a viable trekking route along the Lesser Caucasus mountain range. We surveyed over 5,000 kilometres of trails in Georgia and Armenia that had been previously unrecorded, and all of that data was added to OpenStreetMap, which is the open source user-generated map of the world that powers apps like Strava and Komoot and Maps.me and Gaia and basically every app that people use for planning hikes. Now, it wouldn't have been a proper expedition if everything had gone to plan. We might have had to have been pulled out of a couple of tight spots. We'd actually fallen off the edge of a landslide in this one. Alessandro got into a fight with a patch of giant hogweed. And he lost. So the medical term is phytophotodermatitis, in case you were wondering. It's all right. Yeah, it's a bit. Yeah, you're right. These things aside, Land Rover were so impressed that they extended the sponsorship deal for another 3 years. But more than anything else, I think the one thing I took away from that first year of work was just how big and complicated and frankly ludicrous a project I had taken on. So how are footpaths created? How are they maintained? Does anybody know? Okay, stunned silence. How are footpaths made and maintained? So it suddenly seemed really important to answer these questions because our explorations had uncovered a couple of quite inconvenient facts. The first was that many of the historic footpaths were long disused and overgrown to the point of being impassable. Second, there were places where a perfectly good route just had a big gap in it. There was literally no trail between 2 points. So whilst there was plenty of surveying still to be done, there seemed to be another type of work emerging, which was somewhere between civil engineering and a slightly extreme type of gardening. Luckily, we'd spent a week the previous year visiting Paul in northern Georgia to see how he was approaching building the TCT. And Paul had a very different perspective. Where he came from, the idea of pioneering new trails was kind of embedded in the national consciousness, because to colonize the so-called New World, the founding fathers literally had to build new trails across the continental divide. And so it's kind of a normal rite of passage for outdoor-loving young Americans to join volunteer crews and work for the public benefit on tasks like trail building and maintenance. And so from Paul's perspective, the obvious thing to do was to bring this trail building culture to the Caucasus. And so while me and my team were out exploring and surveying and mapping and documenting what was already there, Paul had organised a volunteering programme, the first of its kind in the region, to bring people from all over the world to build the very first brand new section of the TCT. And yeah, people had come from 8 different countries, including Georgia and Armenia, for obvious reasons. Living in the mountains, in a pop-up community, sleeping under the stars, getting your hands dirty, all the good stuff. And it was totally altruistic. Walkers would just never know what we'd done. They would take for granted the ability to walk a safe and unobstructed trail, just as most of us here probably do. A guy called Jonathan had come over from the US to train and to lead the volunteers, having spent 10 years working in national parks all over America as a professional trail crew leader. Not only is that an actual job, but the US even has a professional trail builders association, as well as reams of literature and standards and training and a whole industry. And it all revolves around making your work as invisible as possible, laying lightly on the land, to borrow a phrase from the title of a well-known trail building manual. So by the end of the week, a brand new section of the trail had been built. We'd had a crash course in sustainable trail design and construction. And there was an answer to the question of how these gaps in our route might be filled. Something else the Land Rover expedition had done was enable us to make quite a lot of noise about it, and that was thanks to a pretty heavy element of social media storytelling about what must have really looked like the fun part of the job. We started being asked for information about the unfinished route by impatient adventurers who'd been following our progress and wanted to be the first to hike it. One of them, a chap called Val, was so persistent that I eventually did send him my prototype route, along with an extremely long list of caveats. He promptly took the data, filled in the blanks himself, and through sheer force of determination, became the first person we know of to attempt to hike some version of the TCT from one end of the other at the end of 2017. So by this point, other funders were starting to pay attention, and in early 2017, two of them agreed to back a project which would be modelled on Paul's pilot project, but on an altogether bigger scale. We decided on Dilijan National Park in Armenia for many reasons. It was already known as the best place to go hiking in Armenia, despite lacking any kind of functional trail network or even a visitor centre, or in fact any useful infrastructure for the hikers. But we'd mapped out enough routes to see that by building a few new connections and publishing some good maps and information, we could actually transform this national park, allowing us to not just launch the first Armenian section of the TCT, but also a revitalised trail network for the national park itself. It was around this time that I met a guy called Hans. And Hans was an American of mixed German and Armenian ancestry. He'd already visited Dilijan as a tourist, and he really wanted to find a way to put his profession as a trail builder to use in what he saw as his ancestral homeland. So I saw the connection and immediately tried to hire him, and we put together a small team of ambitious Armenians who I'd met during the previous year's Transcaucasian expedition. So before I knew it, I was embarking on the second most intense and fascinating year of my life, running the first major trail building project in Armenia since independence. And it took months of preparation, 10 weeks in the field, 55 staff and volunteers, but we somehow built from scratch and mostly by hand about 7 miles or about 12 kilometres of brand new footpaths through the forests of the national park to create a 5-day loop that took in the limestone cliffs and the old-growth forests, the natural lakes and the ancient monasteries surrounding Dilijan. It also put several villages on the trail network that had never previously seen tourism. And this was deliberately as much about theatre as it was about trail building. We invited the national TV crews to cover our work on the evening news. Discovery Channel sent a crew of virtual reality filmmakers to make a piece on the project. It turned out about 10 years too early. We gave talks in Dilijan and Yerevan, inviting our Armenian volunteers to share their experiences too. And there was a reason for this, which had nothing to do with bragging or accomplishments. It was that I'd realised that something was fundamentally missing here, something I'd absolutely taken for granted back home, which was a culture of the outdoors. And if we wanted to change that, we would have to start telling a new story. And as for why outdoor culture wasn't part of mainstream society, well, partly, perhaps it's because mountaineers in the Soviet times were elite state-sponsored athletes, but it could also be because of the turbulent, more recent history of the region. Because when these 3 Soviet socialist republics declared independence, they also immediately went to war with each other over which bit of land was whose. So, as well as Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan, there were actually 3 additional self-declared nations in the Caucasus: Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Nagorno-Karabakh. None of these were internationally recognised. They were all the cause of long-standing disputes, usually also involving Russia. And because the TCT would have to remain neutral, they put significant chunks of the region off limits. And you can't just cross the borders anywhere you like. There are only 2 options for crossing from Georgia to Azerbaijan, and only 3 border posts between Georgia and Armenia. And finally, there are no border crossings between Armenia and Azerbaijan or Armenia and Turkey at all, and haven't been since 1993. Also, the Azeris hate the Armenians, the Georgians hate the Armenians and the Russians. The Armenians love the Russians, hate the Azeris, distrust the Georgians but love Georgian food. The Iranians love everybody, and the Russians just don't. And this had not exactly paved the way for stable living conditions and the time and money for recreational walking. So in spite of all of that, we'd kind of assumed that our work would be received positively. Generally it was, except for a small group of very loud people claiming that Armenia was, in fact, not part of the Caucasus at all. And the entire premise of a TCT crossing Armenia was therefore invalid. And this is where I ran into the first of many unexpected conflicts. Because if your ancestors were the subjects of imperial powers, then concepts in terms like Transcaucasia or even Eastern Turkey evoke a kind of history of subjugation and injustice and deep unhealed wounds. And with my wife's paternal grandfather, a genocide survivor himself, I could certainly empathise with that. But something else was going on as well, because as we were wrapping up the Dilijan project, we found out that a swanky launch party was happening in Yerevan for a first long-distance trail across Armenia. And social media began to fill up with photos of another group of hikers, also with a specially modified 4x4, installing their own signposts on some of the same trails that we'd mapped out the previous year. And I initially found it really hard to understand why we wouldn't all be better off working together. But perhaps if you've seen society collapse overnight and you've watched your friends and family die in pointless conflicts, and you're struggling to make ends meet in what we just call a developing country, then trust towards outsiders, which I still most definitely was, doesn't come that easily. And I try to remember also that saying about imitation and the sincerest form of flattery and all that stuff. But in any case, our supporters massively outweighed the detractors, and I decided the best approach was keep quiet, stick to our principles, and just see how things unfolded. Suddenly, we had bigger fish to fry anyway, because the citizens of Armenia decided to stage a full-scale revolution. So out went the communist-era cronies, and in came an outspoken newspaper editor called Nikol Pashinyan. And how did he galvanize the nation behind him? By walking 110 kilometers from Armenia's former capital of Gyumri to Yerevan's Republic Square, where Lenin's statue had once stood. I actually happened to be there on the day that the regime toppled. And I can tell you there was one hell of a party that night. It's not often you get to participate in overthrowing a government. Maybe those skills will come in handy one day. Bad joke. Anyway, as the dust settled, it felt like the mood in Armenia had changed. Suddenly there was hope. You could feel it. People couldn't believe they were being told that the future belonged to them. And at the same time, the shape and the scale of our job was becoming clearer, because the Dilijan project had proven a well-known concept, which is that if you want to solve a big problem, break it up into lots of smaller ones. And as well as Dilijan, we identified about 4 other hotspots across Armenia for new trail networks. And if we could establish one new hiking destination at a time, and then connect them together with routes we already knew, then the first national scale branch of the TCT actually started feeling achievable and beneficial to more people than just a few hardcore long distance hikers, and therefore much easier to fundraise and get support for. Hans had been so inspired by the Armenians he'd met on the Dilijan project that he actually decided to set up his own NGO in Armenia, Trails for Change, using the profits of his US trail building contractor business to hire the local team and establish Armenia's first dedicated trail building outfit. And heading up the team was Ashot, who had project managed the efforts in Dilijan, desperate to leave his job in finance permanently behind him and help pioneer the future of Armenia's trails. Grants and contracts began to come in to Trails for Change, and Hans trained up his team to rebuild and reopen the disused trails, meaning that I could jump ahead and use my skills as an explorer to help map out future projects. In 2018, we headed for Armenia's central province of Vayat Zor, where we explored and mapped a network of medieval footpaths connecting 5 villages with the dramatic canyons that they were set in. This was a 2-year project that opened up another 181 kilometres of the TCT, this time marked and signposted according to the new guidelines that we'd collaborated on with the Armenian government. In 2019, we moved south to Syunik province, Armenia's southernmost and the home of the iconic Datev monastery. And our slightly more realistic timescale for building the TCT meant that we got to slow down yet further, starting months or in some cases years in advance, gradually uncovering the network of footpaths and pack routes that connected these monasteries with nearby fortresses, caravanserais, and medieval settlements. This is also where we first experimented with using drone technology. This allowed us to design flight plans, automatically pilot the drones on them, and generate aerial imagery in 3D models down to like centimetre level detail. And it really transformed our work. We could send drones on reconnaissance missions into complicated terrain and explore them remotely, which meant that the fun but very laborious on-the-ground surveys would be far more efficient. And it allowed far more detailed and accurate mapping than had ever previously been done in Armenia. And all of this was achieved just with everyday smartphones and consumer-grade drones costing a few £100, along with a platform called Drone Deploy, which is actually designed for the construction and agriculture industries. So by the time we made it to the last of these hotspots along the TCT in Armenia, which was the Debed Canyon in the northern province of Lori, I'd got this process down to a really fine art. I could almost guarantee where I would find unmapped historic trails, just waiting to be repurposed as part of a modern Armenian recreational walking network. Local funders would see a multitude of benefits in connecting villages in this way, and they would be there to take ownership of the trails once they were established. Hans and his team would do the heavy-duty lifting. Alessandro and his friend Simon, a cartography PhD, would do the map making. I would do the trail notes, and the rest would be done by the hikers. And I really started to see this as a process of rediscovery and reinterpretation, because I make no claim to have been the first to set foot in any of these places. And for one thing, many of these forgotten footpaths had been really laboriously engineered, which suggests strong economic motives for once building them. I was simply the first to find and document them in a modern context. So you could call it re-exploration, perhaps. And I got thinking how many other corners of the world were there where something similar might be done. And maybe it's something to think about next time a journalist asks if there's anything left to explore. So by the start of 2021, I'd covered tens of thousands of kilometres of dirt roads and footpaths in the Land Rover and on foot, covering every inch of this evolving route multiple times in both directions and in every season. But would I finally, after all these years, be able to walk a continuous, unbroken line from one end of Armenia to the other? That seemed to be the only meaningful test. So in June of 2021, I met up with Megan Neal, another American living in Tbilisi, and also the new executive director of the Transcaucasian Trail Association, a US non-profit that Paul had set up to raise funds for the TCT in the States. And together we spent 40 days walking 827 kilometers, or about 514 miles, from Lake Arpi National Park in the far northwest of Armenia to the town of Megri on the Iranian border in the south. Had I actually gone and done this thing? Sitting in Megri with a very well-earned beer, I couldn't help thinking of Terry, the Frenchman who I'd met 6 years previously. He was the first of so many connections that had got us to this point. Things moved pretty quickly from that point forward. I sat down to turn the hundreds of thousands of data points into a map and a trail guide for hikers. I drafted a guidebook, dumping everything I had learnt about hiking in Armenia into a single volume. And we teamed up with the #1 long-distance trail navigation app, Far Out, to launch this first national section of the TCT. And sure enough, in 2022, the first hikers began to appear. And I know this because my wife and I opened a hostel in Dilijan so we could meet them all. And these were mostly adventurous hikers from the global north, from Europe, from America, Australia, who had got the time and the opportunities to give the next big thing, an international through hiking, a try. But I mean, and this is more significant to me, it was also people from the region who suddenly had the means to connect with their own corners of the world. This is Shushan. She's an Armenian hiking guide who I've been working with for many years. And next month, May 2025, plans to become the first Armenian to hike the full length of the TCT in her home country. At the same time, thanks to Megan and her team's efforts in Georgia, the published route has since been extended all the way to the Black Sea. And a few intrepid people have now hiked the entire 1,500 kilometre north to south route. And thanks to a few keen Azerbaijanis, 374 kilometres of trail is hikeable in the Greater Caucasus of Azerbaijan as well, with a fully connected route well in the works. And it's absolutely worth mentioning that the TCT, as far as we know, is the only cross-border project in the Caucasus that actively involves participants from all three nations. And you will never see an Armenian and Azeri with their arms around each other anywhere else. I can't even publish this photo. We're yet to have the Armenians and Azeris visit each other in their own countries, but you can only hope. The regional geopolitics, of course, is always a risk. And as if COVID wasn't enough, in September 2020, war broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and I will never forget having to explain to a trekking group over the hotel breakfast table that strange booming sound in the background is actually the neighbouring country invading. In Georgia, the Russian-backed far-right government enacted a so-called foreign agents law, which meant all NGOs receiving international funding were put on a very menacing-sounding watch list, and that wasn't a risk anybody wanted to take, which meant that the Georgia-based NGO that was set up a few years previously had to be shut down. And just when we thought things couldn't get any worse, our long-term training programs for local crew leaders, which were funded by the United States Forest Service, were cancelled just a few weeks ago. If only Putin and Trump had hiked some of the TCT. But the TCT seems to have kind of turned into a movement at this point. It's gone far beyond my or anyone else's original desire just to go for a walk. And I think it's pretty hard to stop something with that kind of momentum. And that's just as well, really, because the only reason I'm even telling you this story is because my wife and I have recently moved back to the UK. Because it turns out all of this somehow qualified me for a job at the RGS as their new Expeditions and Fieldwork Manager alongside Shane Windsor, who I'm sure some of you will know very well. And now I'm here, my thoughts are turned to the next set of connections and how to link our long British tradition of exploration for the greater good to this ongoing work in the Caucasus. And what I think this means is setting up a charity to fundraise and advocate for the project, kind of a Friends of the TCT kind of thing. This is a completely new venture for me, actively seeking help with it. And if anyone in this room should have any advice, please do say, even if it's just to tell me not to do it. It's been a very long and winding road. There's plenty more to come, and I really hope you've enjoyed traveling it with me. Thank you very much. Classmates, how are we doing?
Thank you so much. That was absolutely riveting. And I can't stop thinking, Terry, how a chain-smoking man can walk that distance. But anyway, thank God that he gave you the light bulb moment.
Indeed.
You've created an amazing thing, and obviously built an incredible team along the way. It was riveting to hear about it. I'm sure there are lots of questions.
Yeah.
How much work or contact have you had with the Ordnance Survey International team? They do geospatial work?
Contact with with OS. We're talking to them about where they get their paper at one point, because we were trying to essentially publish OS style maps of the Caucasus. So there was a conversation about their printing process and their suppliers, but they obviously produce maps in much bigger quantities than we would be able to shift at an early stage. So that was as far as it went.
I think that you could open up the routes to broader audiences on that.
Absolutely. We have actually published four folded sheet maps of different parts of Armenia, not Georgia yet. I wish I had some to show you. They're in the post from Italy at the moment, so apologies for that.
I was going to ask, you said at the hospital, have other communities jumped on board and developed some hostels, or have been unique there or something?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. That's a whole aspect of the project that I can't possibly cram into the 45 minutes, but at least as much time and effort and money has been spent on business development along the trail as it has on trail construction. In some places, in Dilijan, for example, every village that we put on the trail network in 2017 now has multiple guest houses and campsites. These are all grassroots set up by the local people in response to seeing the opportunities that hiking tourism brought. In other places, there's been funding programs. There was a big one from 2019 to 2021 with EU funding, about €500,000 to set up a guest house network in the south of Armenia, which is kind of a much more top-down approach. Some of them are still there, but yeah, in general, there's been a lot of work done on that side of things as well. The way the routes are designed mean that you can do guest house to guest house sections, but you do need to camp if you want to do the whole thing. It's a mixture of kind of front country and wilderness. Yeah.
Well done, Tom. Great job. Setting up of a hostel at the start point sounds a bit like insider trading to me, but good, very entrepreneurial. Are two wheels banned from your trail?
Great question. No, there are many ways that you could cycle something like the TCT. If you're talking about off-road, bike packing, that kind of thing, I've kind of been working on a route for mountain bikes as a side project in all that spare time I had. Took a group on it in 2019, and we did do something like the TCT north to south in Armenia in about 14 days, I think. Bikepacking.com also has routes in all 3 countries, which again use parts of the TCT. The reason you can't do the whole thing on a bike is because there are some very technical sections of footpath which are just too steep and rocky. You just wouldn't get, I mean, you could hike a bike, but it'd be better to take an alternative. So that was the long answer, but you can bike versions of the TCT, I think is the short version. Yeah. Yeah.
In the beginning, at least, we'll go through some very military sensitive areas. Did we have to have your plans cleared by the government or the military as to where you're proposing push paths?
Yeah, absolutely. So northern Georgia, there's a buffer zone before you actually get to the border itself. Several sections of the route in northern Georgia go through this buffer zone, and whether you're working there or you're hiking there, you do have to get a permit. But because we've managed to establish good relations with local municipalities, local detachments, it's always been possible one way or another to work where we need to work, obviously with some attention paid to making sure we're keeping hikers safe as well. There's a couple of sensitive areas in Armenia as well. When the fighting broke out, there was a lot of restrictions on travel. Having the team being entirely local meant that things were much easier because every male member of our team had been in the army and had the contacts and knew how to talk the talk. But yeah, it's been and then of course there are the closed borders which we can't go anywhere near either. When there's landmines in some places, and it is complex, and that's just why you need to have really good information and contacts.
Do the villages compete to have a path linking themselves to other villages? It might be a big advantage to a village.
There's some very interesting stories about this kind of thing. There was some fierce competition in Georgia where a new bridge was built to make the trail much more simple and logical and to make the river crossing much safer, but it meant that one village was then bypassed. So the villagers just destroyed the bridge. About a day after it had been finished. There was another village in Georgia where the local mayor had been tasked with painting the red and white markers, and he'd kind of convenient, and this is not what I was doing at all. He painted them to go straight to the front door of his guest house, and then all the other villagers got their paint buckets out and suddenly you had this kind of, every street in the village was painted with these way markers. In other cases, we had people destroying the signposts completely just because they didn't know what they were for, or they didn't understand what would change as a result of them being there. And it was something new, and the reaction was something new, kick it over. We went back and we reinstalled them, and after usually a year or two, things made sense. But it wasn't that we could explain what we were doing. We didn't have the language or understanding. Instead, we just had to demonstrate it, and then people would get it.
Over there.
Yes.
If you've only got a week to go and explore the trail, is there a particular section you'd recommend going to?
A week?
Yeah.
Yeah, go to Upper Svaneti anytime after the 1st of July and hike from Mestia to Ushguli. Maybe extend it on one end of that route so that you get to see the quiet bits as well as the popular bits. Or go to Armenia and do 5 days in Dilijan National Park. Or actually, I'll talk to you afterwards because I can just keep going. But yes, the point being you can do sections, short sections, yeah.
Are there any areas where the balance between the number of tourists and the local population is getting out of kilter of concern?
Yes, so again, the example here is northern Georgia, where in the mid-2000s, there was a government-initiated tourism development program designed to make Upper Svaneti to make Mestia, the town, the capital of that region, the new Chamonix. That was the way they pitched it. And they created a trekking route network and poured millions and millions of pounds into marketing. And the result of that is that there is one section of the TCT where we have trail number count, like annual trail traffic in like the 50, 60,000 people a year kind of numbers, and there's not even enough capacity in those villages to accommodate that number of hikers. So that was one of the reasons for extending the route out from that hotspot, because if you can spread the traffic out over a longer period of a longer distance of trail, then you're evening out the benefits and the impact. But there is a balance, and it's definitely not a question of trying to get as many people doing it as possible, because, as you say, that creates other problems. Yeah.
How did you get your drone flight plan approved in those airspace? Here it is CAH.
Yeah.
ICAO is not valid then.
Yeah.
Who did you get the authorization?
So authorization for drone surveys, we benefited greatly from there being absolutely no legislation whatsoever about drones. And it was a case of an agreement with the local municipalities and then flying the drones very early in the morning so that we wouldn't scare the locals. Because there's a great amount of paranoia about drones, because they were heavily used in the Armenia-Azerbaijan war, and a lot of people have PTSD, and so we had to be careful. But essentially, it was about local agreements. Yeah.
One more, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned July before. What sort of time of year, or what's the weather like, or what time of year would you recommend for different sections maybe?
Okay, so the reason I said July is just because there's some high passes which are only generally clear of snow after the start of July in that region of northern Georgia. But in general, you could do most of the TCT anytime from mid to late April through to November. And if it's a dry, late autumn, early winter, you could just keep hiking until the first big snows come. There's some higher altitude sections where the season's a lot shorter. So central part of the Armenia route and some of the high passes in the northern Georgia and Azerbaijan, there's a much more limited window, just because we're talking 3,500 meters. There's not really snow free until mid-June, late June. But yeah, the rest of the area where it's lower down in the valleys, it's a very long season actually. And if you go, depending what time of year you go, of course, you get a completely different experience. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. It's amazing. I think you're going to be staying for a little bit. So if
Yes.
anyone's got any more questions they'd like to ask Tom, then you'll be around. I would like to say that we, as a small charity, wouldn't be able to put on these talks for you guys to enjoy and learn about new things if it weren't for the generous sponsorship of Optimus Points and Ollie Phillips. So thank you. It means a lot, and I think everyone really enjoyed them. And if you did enjoy this evening, then come back next month. We've got Dr. Rosa Espinosa talking about Amazonian stingless bees. So book your tickets on Eventbrite, and hope to see you all again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.